Few philosophers have sparked as much debate as Friedrich Nietzsche. For some, he is seen as a visionary of self-overcoming, a figure who boldly questioned the fundamental beliefs surrounding morality and existence. Conversely, others view him as a perilous thinker whose concepts contributed to nihilism, elitism, and even totalitarian regimes. But is Nietzsche truly the radical he is often portrayed as, or has history warped his legacy beyond recognition? Born in 1844, Nietzsche entered a world still heavily influenced by religious traditions and absolute moral principles. Unlike many philosophers who aim to uphold these foundations, he dedicated his life to dismantling them. His critiques of Christianity, traditional morality, and societal norms were shocking, even offensive, to those of his time. What set him apart was not only his radical ideas, but also the poetic, almost prophetic manner in which he conveyed them. He did not engage in the dry, logical discourse typical of other philosophers. Rather, he expressed his thoughts through aphorisms, parables, and impassioned statements, making his writings both profound and, at times, dangerously open to misinterpretation. Nietzsche's distinctive writing style and provocative ideas naturally elicited extreme responses. Some intellectuals revered him as a courageous seeker of truth who unveiled the hypocrisy of societal norms, while others regarded him as a reckless dismantler of values, a philosopher whose work could legitimize oppression and moral decline. His critique of traditional morality, particularly his dismissal of the notion that suffering is inherently noble, alienated many who viewed self-sacrifice as the ultimate virtue. Simultaneously, his appeal for individuals to transcend societal constraints and recognize their own strength was misinterpreted as a support for tyranny. Ironically, the essence of his philosophy, which advocated for questioning all things, became a double-edged sword, resulting in endless reinterpretations and misrepresentations. Nietzsche's legacy is as complex as his philosophy. Was he a misunderstood innovator, a thinker ahead of his era whose ideas were distorted by subsequent generations? Or was he a perilous radical sowing the seeds of concepts that could and were? The answer may not lie in the labels we attach to him, but in our readiness to engage with his work beyond superficial interpretations. To truly grasp Nietzsche, we must look beyond the myths and recognize the individual behind the controversy. God is dead. 3 words that have resonated through history, often misunderstood, misquoted, and misapplied in ways Nietzsche could never have foreseen. For some, this statement is viewed as a celebration of atheism, a victorious rejection of faith. For others, it represents a blasphemous assertion, a marker of Nietzsche's alleged nihilism. But what if both interpretations completely miss the essence? What if Nietzsche was neither celebrating nor condemning, but rather lamenting the demise of God? In his view, it was not an act of defiance. It was a chilling acknowledgement that the very foundations of meaning had collapsed beneath humanity. When Nietzsche penned these lines in The Gay Science, he did so through the persona of a madman, a character who bursts into a marketplace with a lantern, declaring that we have killed God, yet struggles to find anyone who comprehends the fine significance of his message. This is not a voice of arrogance, but one of despair. Nietzsche understood that the old certainties, faith, divine authority, and moral absolutes, were diminishing in the face of science, secularism, and modernity. However, rather than viewing this as a triumph, he perceived it as a crisis. Without God, where would meaning originate? What would take the place of the moral structures that had guided humanity for centuries? The madman does not rejoice. He issues a warning, and few are willing to heed it. This is where the greatest misconception occurs. Many interpret Nietzsche's declaration as a call to nihilism, as if he were suggesting that without God, nothing holds value. Yet, Nietzsche was more afraid of nihilism than anything else. For him, the death of God was not a conclusion, but a challenge, a void that needed to be filled to prevent humanity from descending into despair and meaninglessness. His entire philosophy, from the will to power to the idea of the Übermensch, was an effort to confront this existential dilemma. If the old values had crumbled, new ones must be forged. Individuals had to take on the responsibility of creating meaning themselves. The real danger lay not in the absence of God, but in how humanity would respond in the aftermath. Yet, history took his words in unforeseen ways. Some radical secularists adopted God is dead as a rallying cry, stripping it of its deeper meaning. Certain political ideologies distorted his concepts to justify power and destruction. Even religious critics misinterpreted him, casting him as the very nihilist he cautioned against. However, Nietzsche was never a proponent of despair. He was a philosopher of change. He proclaimed the death of God not to celebrate it, but to compel humanity to face the emptiness it had created. The crucial question is not whether God is dead, but whether we truly grasp what that signifies. Society has always had a complex relationship with those who refuse to conform. Rebels, visionaries, and outsiders have often been feared, loathed, or even eliminated, not necessarily because they were incorrect, but because they challenged the comfort of the majority. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this conflict better than most. At the heart of his philosophy was a call for individuals to transcend the collective, to reject imposed values, and to forge their own. Yet, in a world that thrives on uniformity, such a message was destined to encounter resistance. Was Nietzsche merely advocating for personal strength, or was he promoting a perilous elitism? For those who misinterpreted him, the distinction between inspiration and arrogance appeared perilously narrow. Central to Nietzsche's philosophy is the concept of the Übermensch, or Overman, a figure who surpasses traditional morality and carves out their own path. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch represented not a ruler or tyrant, but rather a manifestation of human potential. He dismissed the notion that individuals should passively accept inherited traditions and external authorities. Instead, he championed the idea of self-overcoming, a continuous journey of questioning, growth, and transcending limitations. However, such transformation is challenging and often met with resistance from those who benefit from conformity. When individuals choose not to adhere to the societal norms imposed upon them, they incite fear, resentment, and frequently outright hostility. This is where Nietzsche introduced one of his most provocative ideas: resentment. He contended that many moral values, especially those stemming from religious and social traditions, emerged not from genuine virtue, but from bitterness. Those who felt powerless, rather than striving for self-improvement, constructed a morality that depicted strength as evil and weakness as virtuous. In this framework, sacrifice was deemed noble, ambition was labeled sinful, and suffering was regarded as a mark of righteousness. Nietzsche believed this resulted in a society that condemned the strong simply for their strength, while individuals were shamed for attempting to rise above the collective. It was not a morality rooted in truth, but rather in vengeance, a concealed bitterness towards those who dared to aspire for more. This is where Nietzsche becomes particularly threatening in the eyes of society. He does not provide solace, but rather provocation. He compels us to examine whether we are adhering to our own principles or those that have been forced upon us. Are we genuinely moral or merely fearful? Are we driven by authentic conviction or by envy towards those who possess what we lack? These are challenging inquiries, making Nietzsche an uncomfortable thinker to engage with. For some, his philosophies are liberating, a call to celebrate individuality and reject false morals. For others, they are profoundly disturbing, even offensive. After all, it is much simpler to label a radical as a threat than to consider the possibility that they might be correct. Few philosophical concepts have been as widely misinterpreted as Nietzsche's idea of the will to power. To some, it represents a doctrine of sheer force, a rationale for domination and control. To others, it signifies a pathway to self-mastery and personal growth. But what was Nietzsche's true intention? Unlike many philosophical ideas that focus on external frameworks, such as society, politics, and ethics, the will to power is much more intimate. It is not about exerting control over others. It is about conquering oneself. Yet, history has often distorted it into something much more sinister. For Nietzsche, all living beings are propelled by a fundamental drive, not for survival, nor for happiness, but for power. However, in his view, power is not merely about exerting control over others. It represents the driving force behind growth, ambition, and creativity. It is the motivation that inspires an artist to create, a thinker to explore new ideas, and an athlete to push their limits. It focuses on expansion rather than oppression, the urge to transcend boundaries, to improve oneself, and to evolve beyond one's previous state. Yet, due to the heavy connotations of the term power, many have mistakenly interpreted Nietzsche as endorsing tyranny. This is where the misunderstanding begins. The peril of the will to power does not stem from Nietzsche's philosophy itself, but from its misapplication. Certain political movements have misappropriated it as a rationale for domination, simplifying it to a might makes right mentality. Others have viewed it as a harsh, unforgiving perspective on existence where only the strongest are entitled to succeed. However, Nietzsche's authentic vision was much more nuanced. He did not regard power as a tool for subjugating others, but rather as a means of self-creation. For him, true power was the capacity to determine one's own fate, to rise above mediocrity, and to reject the comforting falsehoods that keep many people passive. There is a reason why Nietzsche's concepts provoke discomfort in many. The will to power questions the very idea of stability, proposing that life is not about achieving peace, but about ongoing struggle and transformation. This philosophy is not meant for those who seek comfort. It is intended for individuals ready to face uncertainty and even suffering in their quest for something greater. This may explain why Nietzsche is such a polarizing figure. When his ideas are examined without distortion, they do not endorse domination. Instead, they call for transformation. The crucial question is not whether we embrace or reject the will to power, but whether we are prepared to confront its demands. Friedrich Nietzsche's name has been linked to some of the most extreme ideologies in modern history, particularly those associated with fascism and totalitarianism. His writings, often misunderstood and misappropriated, became slogans for movements that sought power and control. However, to simplify Nietzsche's philosophy by associating it solely with the actions of others is not only unjust, but also dangerously reductive. The real issue is not whether Nietzsche's ideas can be distorted, but why they were so readily appropriated, and whether that was ever his aim. Nietzsche himself held little respect for nationalism or the state. He viewed the state as a tool for suppressing individual greatness, an institution that frequently attempted to stifle the very creativity and freedom. How did Nietzsche's philosophy come to be linked with authoritarianism? The answer partially lies with his sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who edited and published many of his works following his mental breakdown. Staunch nationalist and anti-Semite, Elisabeth selectively preserved and modified Nietzsche's ideas to align with her own political beliefs. This misrepresentation of Nietzsche's authentic vision was further exacerbated by others in the early 20th century who aimed to exploit his ideas for their own agendas. Consequently, Nietzsche's philosophy was taken out of context and used to justify actions he would have opposed. This distortion has endured over the years, with Nietzsche's name frequently appearing in political discussions surrounding power, identity, and authority. Despite the evident political manipulation of his writings, Nietzsche's genuine philosophy remains profoundly humanistic. His advocacy for individuals to rise above the herd mentality, to forge meaning in a chaotic world, and to embrace life in all its unpredictability stands in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchical systems that later claimed to be his ideological shares. Thus, Nietzsche's legacy is marked by deep contradictions. His thoughts have fueled both liberation and oppression, creation and destruction. To truly understand him, we must distinguish the man from the myth, the philosopher from the politics. Nietzsche was not a herald of hatred or violence, but rather of struggle and transformation. He did not promote the subjugation of others, but rather the mastery of oneself, advocating for personal ownership of one's journey, liberated from the limitations of societal norms. So why is Nietzsche often met with disdain? Perhaps it's not solely due to his statements, but rather the discomfort his ideas evoke within us. Nietzsche's philosophy compels us to confront the more troubling aspects of ourselves and our society, our grudges, our anxieties, and our role in maintaining the existing order. Engaging with Nietzsche means questioning everything, including the principles we cherish most. It's easy to misinterpret him, even easier to disregard him. However, the true challenge lies not in defending or attacking Nietzsche, but in understanding why his thoughts elicit such intense responses, and what they reveal about our contemporary world.